Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of the National Catholic Educational Association, thank you for joining us for this professional development opportunity. I am Christy Blewett. I'm honored and excited to be NCEA's facilitator for today's webinar, Nurturing the Soul, Cultivating Spiritual Growth in Catholic Schools. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping items to note. First, this session is being recorded and will soon be available on ncea.org through your membership portal for future reference. Next, we welcome your thoughts today. Please submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box. Our presenters and I will actively monitor the Q&A box and do our best to respond throughout and definitely before the end of today's session. Finally, stay tuned. Once our presenters have concluded, a link to our online survey along with instructions on how to obtain a certificate of completion for this webinar will be shared. So welcome to the first of 3 webinars hosted by the Roche Center in partnership with NCEA, featuring the Whole Child Education Playbook, which was published this spring. Designed with educators in mind, the playbook offers a wealth of practical resources for practitioners. Authored by Drs. Melody Wittenbach, Molly McMahon, John Reyes, Michael Boyle, Katie Ward, and Victoria Burgess, the playbook emerged from a national convening at Boston College in 2022, where 55 scholars, philanthropists, and practitioners gathered to explore whole child education and its distinct connection to Catholic education. The result is a comprehensive framework and shared definition to guide whole child education in U.S. Catholic schools. Now let's meet our host for today's panel. Dr. Melody Wittenbach is the Executive Director of the Roche Center for Catholic Education at Boston College and a faculty member in the Lynch School of Education and Human Development. A national leader in Catholic education, she has held key roles in academia and school leadership, including assistant professor at Notre Dame's Alliance for Catholic Education and president of Nativity Jesuit Academy. Her research focuses on urban Catholic education, system-level leadership, governance, and character formation. A widely published scholar, she has degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Marquette University, and Mount Mary College. Welcome, Dr. Wittenbach. But we start today, as we do all things, with a prayer. Please join me in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving and gracious God, we come before you today with grateful hearts, seeking wisdom and inspiration in our mission to nurture the souls of those entrusted to our care. Bless our presenters as they share their knowledge and experience in cultivating spiritual growth in our Catholic schools. May our conversation today be guided by your Holy Spirit, leading us to new insights and a deeper commitment to forming communities rooted in faith, virtue, and love. Strengthen our resolve to create spaces where students, parents, and faculty encounter your presence daily through prayer, service, and the witness of our lives. Lord, bless all Catholic educators with the grace to inspire, the wisdom to lead, and the compassion to serve. May our work always reflect your love and draw others closer to you. We ask this in the name of Jesus Christ, our teacher and our guide. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. It is my distinct honor to turn things over to the host of our panel today, Dr. Melody Wittenbach, Director of the Roche Center for Catholic Education. The floor is yours, Dr. Wittenbach, the screen.
Thank you. Thank you, Christy, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. So welcome to our webinar on Nurturing the Soul, Cultivating Spiritual Growth in Catholic Schools. And before I introduce the amazing panelists that will join me momentarily for this conversation, I want to set the context as to why this playbook at this moment in time and why it's so important to kind of think about what's the purpose and what's the need, how does it fulfill a need right now. And I want to reference the introduction of our book, where we note that American youth are facing heightened mental health challenges due to the lasting impacts of the pandemic, climate disruptions, economic instability, political unrest, and mass violence. Reports from the CDC and the Surgeon General in 2022 highlighted a significant rise, as we know, in anxiety, depression, and suicide attempts among children. And as schools reflect society, educators are increasingly called to support students' cognitive, social, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being in response to these complex needs. And so our team gathered together and really thought to ourselves, we need to be able to respond to this in this moment in time, considering this very evolving, complex, dynamic world that we're living in. And so we are at this juncture where a prompt, comprehensive response from the adults who are vested with the care of these children is imperative to address the holistic needs within our Catholic educational institutions and educational institutions broadly. And so that's why we wrote this text. And it took 2 years to really deeply investigate how Catholic schools educate the whole child. And so to ground our work, and here we note a little bit about kind of those burdens and kind of the things that our Surgeon Generals and others note. But really to ground our work, what we did was we began by designing a framework for whole child education in the U.S. Catholic schools. So what I'm going to do is just give a brief overview of this framework that you can see here on our screens. On the left-hand side, we really note a set of core beliefs. We believe that our Catholic faith really informs all of what we do. We have that Catholic worldview with which we look at the world and how we educate our students. And so for our center, the Ignatian pedagogy is really critical to how we look at and walk with our students. And so we have 5 core beliefs that we articulated for our framework. And now your religious institution, your Catholic school, may be supported by a different religious entity. And so really kind of examining what are those beliefs that your Dominican tradition, your Franciscan tradition, the broad Catholic school tradition that you want to integrate into your Catholic school. How do you do that on a daily basis? And really coming to a deep understanding of what those beliefs are is essential to begin the work. And so that's what we did. And we grounded again in the Ignatian pedagogy and the Ignatian spirituality. Additionally, on the right-hand side, you can see that we recognize the ecosystem that every child is living in and among. It's not just our schools and our families that are shaping our children, it's the additional things, right? Our social media presence, the ways that the accessibility to healthcare, to resources for our students. And so we take a look and say that the ecosystem really impacts also our child's development. In addition to this, we really dive deeply into domain areas in our context. And we have this kind of cycle in the center where these areas are cyclical and indicating that this is ongoing and changing, that our students are developing in the physical, the spiritual, the emotional, the cognitive, and social domains. And it's really important for us to tend to that. And you'll note there's kind of a dotted line throughout. And this is to note that there's an interconnectivity between each of those domains. And so we really take a look at in our text as to how are we operationalizing these various domains and how are we understanding the applicability in our Catholic schools as to how our students are developing holistically. And so to that end, today, as we noted, we're going to be focusing on the spiritual domain. And I'm joined here today by 3 amazing individuals, and they're going to help us understand and think a little bit about how teachers and leaders play a critical role in developing vibrant faith communities. And so joining me here on the webinar today, we have Jim Schultz, who is the Director of Mission and Identity for Seton Catholic Schools. Jim manages and collaborates with 14 Seton Catholic schools and parishes in the Milwaukee area to promote and develop Catholic identity within the students, faculty, and partnering communities. So welcome, Jim. Jessica Abar currently serves as the principal of Cathedral High School in New York City, a 120-year-old school, right, all-girls Catholic high school that provides an outstanding college preparatory education rooted in faith, academics, and values to its young women. And previously, Jessica served as principal for 6 years at St. Athanasius School in the South Bronx in the Archdiocese of New York. So welcome, Jess. Additionally, we have Katie Ward, who is the program coordinator for the American Indian Catholic Schools Network Teaching Fellows Program at Holy Cross College. She's also a doctoral student in curriculum, instruction, and teacher education at Michigan State University. So welcome to our 3 incredible panelists who are really putting into practice a lot of what we discuss in our spiritual domain area into their everyday life. So let's delve into the unique and essential facets of this domain, and let's begin with Jim and Jess. Can you share a little bit about how your school network defines and communicates its unique spirituality and identity and core beliefs to students and families and to the wider community? And so let's actually start with Jim, if you could begin for us.
Sure. Thanks, Melody. I'll tackle all three if I can in the 5 minutes that I have. So, in terms of the students, we incorporate what are called our seat and values within the school community that change every 2 weeks. So that incorporates a new prayer for the 2 weeks, a scripture reading, and a saint and value that are connected. And so those are posted in every classroom. And some of our schools choose to fashion awards of the month after our values or after that saint that has passed for those 2 weeks. And they incorporate that into a value system of their own where they highlight student behavior. It could be academic success. So it's using those very famous Bible passages and saints that we know from our Catholic tradition and utilizing in a way that comes down to the students in their practical lived reality in the classroom. The second thing, excuse me, that we try to do, especially with our families, is we have two programs that we run. One is a Seton Believers Bulletin that comes out monthly, which explains the tenets of the Catholic Church to our families who may or may not be familiar. So it generally follows the liturgical calendar, and we disseminate that through Class Dojo or whatever your preferred digital communication is. And it highlights the things that are going on within the school, within the church community, so that even if they're brand new to Catholicism, there's an understanding of how you can be part of that community and what we're about at the church. So the one that comes out in September, for example, talks about how or why we make the sign of the cross, which for you and I may be something we take for granted every day. But for someone who's walked into our school for the first time, not necessarily understanding our rituals and traditions, it can be daunting. So we want to invite them in with a newsletter with a way of explaining our beautiful faith to them. The second thing we do for families is called our Family Engagement Program. This is a program where we invite parents to come and nurture themselves in different ways, be it faith, be it physical needs or basic needs, cultural needs, and education, furthering their education. And these are for parents specifically without their kids, because we know that parents can't pour into their families when they're empty themselves. And so we want to nurture and uplift our parents in a way that brings them into our community, both spiritually with programs that are designed to do spiritual counseling, that are designed to talk about how to get back into the parish if you've been absent for a long time, to anything basic needs if they're suffering from job displacement, if they're needing some basic just toiletries and hygienic products for their family. So that's a program that's open to all 14 of our schools with family engagement coordinators. And the last thing I'll talk about is, it wasn't mentioned, but I'll talk about our staff. We have something called faith arcs, which cover our principals and our staff and our faith goals that are to be met basically quarterly. And so that every staff member and leader is aware of the goals we're trying to achieve within our spiritual domain for that given period of time, usually about 6 to 8 weeks. But those are outlined. And so they're aware of, oh, it's November, Advent's coming soon. I have to look at those goals and see where I need to be for my classroom, where I need to be for my students and my families as we prepare for the Advent season, Christmas time. So these are more organizational tools that really help us stay connected to what's important in our spiritual domain, but at the same time give our teachers a sense of confidence because there's also resources attached to them digitally. So they can hop into a folder and say, oh, I need something Advent for my students I totally forgot. Well, here's some awesome templates and some things for them to utilize as we approach that season. So those are just a few ways that we try to incorporate those three important aspects of our school community in our spiritual domain.
I love it. I think it's very creative, the various approaches. And I think you hit on a few things that really resonate, right? The explicit instruction that we need to make sure that we're giving not only to the teacher, the students, the teachers, but the families, because we believe that the parents are the primary educators of our students. And so how do we really help them understand some of those basic things, like you mentioned, the sign of the cross? But then I think too, I love the goal setting, right? So many individuals, when they have a clear goal and they can kind of push themselves to that. So to have that for your faculty and staff in this Faith Arcs program, I think is a really creative way to help kind of really nourish people and get them to see how they can better live out their faith. So it's great.
Thank
Just
you.
same question to you. Like, how about for your school community? You've been at two different school communities. How do you define and communicate that unique spiritual identity and the core beliefs to your students, families, and the community as well?
Awesome. To Jim is a tough act to follow, but I'm going to kind of pepper in from some of the things that he said as well. But I think that adopting and communicating core values is something that I think is really integral in terms of educating the whole child. And you know, core values in schools, you know, they can't just be words on fancy banners, you know, around the building. They really have to be integrated into every aspect of the school. And I think from the leader perspective, I think that core values can kind of serve as a compass of sorts, kind of guiding our decisions, our actions, our priorities even. And as we're working with our school communities towards our mission and trying to live that out, I think that the core values can kind of serve as guardrails, right, to keep us focused and on track. And in working with partnership schools in the past in the Archdiocese of New York at St. Athanasius, I really witnessed how fully integrating core values can positively impact a community, both at the school level, but then even broader from there. And so one of the first actions that I took when joining the cathedral community was to really sit and spend time with the faculty and staff and work with them to unearth those values that were so important, that were so much of a part of our faith. And so we started by, you know, setting a vision for a cathedral graduate and kind of working backwards, seeing those trends, seeing what values stood out as most important. And I think that as leaders, we have to really make sure that that work is coming from within so that it's genuine and authentic. And I think communicating those values is really about what Jim said, teaching them and practicing them. And so, for example, you know, when working with students on issues related to student behavior, we have things we called core value conversations, right? It isn't just you did this and that's bad and we don't tolerate that, right? It's more like this action didn't show integrity, and integrity is one of our school's core values, and it means doing the right thing even when it's hard. And so I know that was really hard, but you have to be true to who you are and who God created you to be. You know, those are powerful conversations that you can have with your students. And because they're powerful, you know, they have real significance, and the core values can really become tools that they can use. And we need to teach them how and when to use those tools. And I say the word teach really intentionally because I think that just like algebra and writing, I think that core values can and should be taught explicitly to students. Another example, you know, one of our core values is a cathedral is service, and our students are really, really drawn to that value in particular, very passionate about helping others. At the same time, it's up to us as the school leaders and the faculty and the staff to build those structures so that they can practice those values, to make sure that they can participate in service projects, in service club, in campus ministry. And I think that the core value teaching continues from there when we are highlighting and celebrating core values in action, right? Service in action, not just academics and athletics, but also honoring those moments of service within the school community. I think it shows that the values are that important to us.
Love it. Reminds me of this caught, taught, sought, right? When we think about, we want our students, our faculty, our families to come into our, you know, school communities and catch that faith or catch these beliefs. But then we want them, and sometimes we have to be explicit, right, in our teaching. So to your point, I love this idea of envisioning these beliefs and even the depth of our theological foundations as a compass. This is our guidepost. This is what we keep coming back to. So that beautiful example of giving that student that conversation, that core belief conversation around the integrity is really beautiful. But then we hope that we've taught them so well enough that they seek this, that it's out there, they're kind of like wanting and thirsting for more, and they're living that in a really in a way that's just animating these beliefs. So it's beautiful. In thinking a little bit about kind of the role of teachers and staff. So, I mean, Jim, you have a large number, right? 14 schools, a big system. And then I mean, you've come from two different settings, which I like kind of looking at this from the school level. What role do you see teachers and staff playing in fostering that spiritual growth for students beyond formal religious instruction? And maybe could you provide an example or two that might resonate with our listeners here today? So, Jim, to you.
Absolutely. So 3 years ago, when I joined Seton, I was given a project called the Spark Program, which doesn't stand for anything, by the way. Maybe this will be my summer project to come up with a good acronym. And the Spark Program is that every one of our 14 schools has a teacher whose dedicated to the Catholic faith, has illustrated that through their teaching and their culture setting within their classroom. And so they're given a lead role with the principal in promoting the faith amongst the student and faculty population. And they do that through a number of ways. New this year is that every Spark teacher at their school will lead a PD session once a month. And so they're in front of their faculty, basically providing professional development in whatever topic is most liturgically aligned to the season. So of course, again, Advent and Lent, but also things that pop up periodically. We have a Catholic Souls Walk in October where we raise money for our schools, but it's based around a Catholic social teaching, or it's based around a cultural embodiment of the faith that that school represents. So that's one thing that they might plan. They also meet with myself, a former superintendent of Catholic schools in Milwaukee, for their own spiritual development. So once a month, they're pulled with their principal to collaborate with all 13 other principals in Sparks on, hey, what are you guys doing for Lent this year? Maybe we could do a project. For example, this Lent, we're doing a door decorating contest where every door within our 14 schools will have a Station of the Cross on it. So as the students walk to class or walk to lunch, they will see a representation of the liturgical time and the Lenten season. And even if they're not familiar with the Stations of the Cross necessarily, although many of them are, they're going to look and see it every day and be naturally curious. What is this about? Why do we have these up? And so that goes into part of the Spark planning. And as I mentioned previously, the Faith Arc is also designed with the Spark in mind. So the resources that are linked, the templates that are created, they are to share that with their faculty during meetings or meet one-on-one with a faculty member maybe who's struggling. As we know, Catholic teachers are hard to find. And so a lot of our schools have under 50% of teachers who are by tradition Catholic. And so they need a lot of support, and we want to keep great educators with us. And so our Spark teachers support the faculty by meeting with them one-on-one when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to, again, Mass preparation, because the Mass can be a very daunting thing when you've never participated in it, or maybe it's been a very long time. So the Spark is an essential role in our school as they support really the whole faculty and student body in being a faith leader for the school.
So creative. It's the spark is what you need to ignite the faith. So having these individuals who are really serving that role is essential. And so being really intentional about how they're developed, how they're formed. And I love this idea of like the spiritual nourishment happening in community. So across all of your campuses, you're seeing this kind of active engagement. If it's a door decorating, which is a creative way for students to express their faith and kind of, again, seek and catch that kind of the understanding of these different liturgical seasons or a various beliefs. So I think that's great to see it being kind of committed by the whole. Jess, in terms of like your perspective on things, I'd love to hear a little bit more about like the parent involvement in the spiritual formation. Can you share a little bit about like your family faith formation and how you find yourself actively kind of leading that as a lay woman, which I think is something also really important for us to acknowledge, that so much of the passing on the faith in these traditions is really being carried forward by lay men and women who believe deeply and feel this is part of their vocation. So what are your thoughts?
So kind of as Jim mentioned, you know, in many of our Catholic schools, including Cathedral High School and St. Athanasius before that, many students are not Catholic or not practicing Catholics. And, you know, I've never viewed that as a barrier, as an obstacle, but rather as a gift, right? It's a gift to share our faith with others. And we've found time and time again that families really appreciate learning about the faith and getting involved. And so I think there are many ways to involve parents and families in this, but I think one of the most simplest or most accessible, at least, is simply through invitation. Is, you know, if you're celebrating a Mass, invite the parents. If you're having a Stations of the Cross prayer service, invite the parents. Doing a school-wide service project, you know, invite and involve the parents. I think inviting is the very first step. As humans, we gravitate towards being included and being welcomed. And so even they might not be able to come, or they might not be able to come to all of them. But I think that knowing that the door is open for them at their child's school is very, very significant. And inviting them in and seeing how we live it at our faith at school really gives parents their own playbook for, in some ways for how they can kind of bring that home if they felt called to do that. At the high school level, I see parents less than I did at the elementary level, right? They're taking themselves to school. And so that's been something that I've been getting used to. So I felt that I needed to kind of implement another touch point with my families in terms of spiritual formation. And so I have a weekly memo, just like every other principal, right? I'm sure, that goes out every Saturday to parents. And I try to actually use that in a creative way to engage them in spiritual formation in a way that's very accessible to them. I hate to use the word easy, but yes, easy. For example, I will link Sunday's mass readings in the memo so that they can easily access them. I will provide a reflection question on the gospel from that Sunday's mass. I will link the parish finder that our archdiocese has available so that they could find their closest church and their closest mass to them. When there's a special feast day, I will tell them what the feast day is about, right? Something as simple as that. This is what the celebration is. This is why we celebrate. This is how different people celebrate it. Again, include video clips or links to hymns that are related to that. Just like simple things that make it easy for them to kind of get involved. Our memo also includes shout outs every week, shouting out for academics or athletics, but I also make sure to shout out who read at Mass or, who participated in this recent service project or who won the Lenten door decorating contest, right? That Jim was referring to, things like that. By including those in your shout outs, you're telling people, you're telling your families and your faculty and your staff and your students what your school emphasizes and what they think is important. And so by shouting those things out, I think that really tells families something, and they say that when you walk into a Catholic school, you should know it's a Catholic school. And I think the same concept can be applied to other areas. When families read your newsletter, can they tell it's a Catholic school? Is a question that you can ask. And I think for leaders, it's a very simple but easy way to engage families in that. And it's a great place to start is by looking at your communication that you already have with your parents and tweaking it from there.
Awesome. Very true. Right. I think everybody wants to feel that sense of belonging as you're really sharing and kind of that creating those spaces of hospitality. And by inviting others in is really an essential part of beginning this important journey with parents at all levels, right? Elementary or high school. And so everybody wants to feel that connectivity to their child's school. So it's really wonderful, the various ways that you've shared, and communication can never communicate enough. And I think taking a very celebratory, joyful way with which you're kind of sharing the faith. So thank you for sharing those examples. Katie, everybody's been waiting to hear from you. Now I want to make note that Katie was the lead author of this chapter on spirituality. So Katie, thank you for waiting patiently in the wings while we heard from Jim and Jess. But I would like to just turn to you a bit because you have extensive research in this area. Obviously, you've authored this amazing chapter, but also too in your work, right? The work that you do with the American Indian and Catholic Network of Schools, but also in your, research and your studies. So what I'd love to hear from you to begin, like we're seeing an increasing number of non-Catholics attend our schools. And so in your research on Catholic schools and spirituality, would love to hear from you on how are schools integrating students of various faith traditions to help them feel part of the community?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Jim and Jess went ahead of me because I think we've already heard so many great examples of how this is getting lived out in each of their school contexts. So I really just see kind of some of my thoughts and research really building on that. Something we really emphasize in this chapter in our approach to the spiritual domain is that spiritual formation in Catholic schools and attending to this spiritual domain for students is not just religious instruction or religious education or these kind of catechetical elements. It's really inviting students to form a living relationship with God. And that's very invitational, kind of as Jess was saying, that it invites students in from Catholic traditions, non-Catholic traditions, and those who don't identify with a particular religious background, but choose to come to Catholic schools for that aspect of spiritual formation and recognizing that as part of what it means to be a whole person and what it means to form someone in the fullness of who they are. And so I think it's really interesting when thinking about the reasons that parents often send their students to Catholic schools, even for non-Catholic parents, spirituality is often a central reason that they're choosing to send students to Catholic schools, especially for those who are coming from other religious traditions. This openness to spiritual formation, the values that are shared in a Catholic school community, and the ability to have these open conversations about faith and living faith into that relationship with God, especially in the community of a school, is really central. And so the ability to talk about God in classrooms, develop spirituality, and keeping that very inclusive and open to parents is a really important way to do that. So just a couple common ways that schools are doing this. One is just inviting students and families to share about their own religious traditions, and then to put that into dialogue with Catholic tradition. I think we had examples both from Jim and Jess about ways that schools are serving as a bit of a conduit for the Catholic faith, for parents and families learning about what it means to be a Catholic community, a Catholic school, whether that's something that's informing their current practice as identifying Catholics, or if that's something that's kind of a new thing for them to dialogue with. You see a lot of families talking about how you can learn from this tradition, even if it's not your own, and how that might inform your own practice. And I think also we're seeing invitation to families, as Jess was sharing, about inviting parents into liturgies, inviting parents at the beginning of the year. Like I know when I was a Catholic school educator, right? Talking to teachers at the beginning of the year and talking to families about how are you learning about the religious traditions of your students' families. When you send out that survey at the beginning of the year about student interests and parent backgrounds, are you including aspects of spirituality? What are you celebrating at home? How does this relate to what we're doing in school? Are there ways that you can invite families in to maybe lead the celebrations of some of those feast days, especially if they're from traditions other than your own? And emphasizing that this type of interfaith engagement is also part of what we do as Catholics, right? We're called to this kind of holistic community. And just one example of this that I think I've really seen in my work is working with Native American Catholic schools, which have varying like student populations in terms of religious identification. Some schools are bringing in classes in Indigenous spiritualities that are interspersed with their classes in Catholic religious formation, and then they're putting those into dialogue with each other, and they'll also lead different ceremonies as well as liturgies that help integrate those two for students. We also see prayer in Indigenous languages, which is an important aspect of spirituality and language coming together in culture, as well as ways of sharing models of faith, whether that's through the saints, through inviting elders in the community, through inviting these different people, both teachers and community members, maybe from outside of the school, to be integrating kind of how they're serving as witnesses to the faith, and how you're diversifying as well who you're inviting as a witness of faith, particularly in majority non-Catholic schools. Are you also inviting from your own religious traditions as well as those of your students for those models of faith? So those are just a few ways, but I think it's really powerful when we think about spirituality, not just as this kind of, are we teaching the faith? Are we, emphasizing this like religious instruction, which is very central, but more of this like living faith of a person coming to know God and coming to grow in relationship? Because if our students don't cultivate that through their Catholic education, we see that it kind of runs dry, once the religious schooling period is finished. So we just want to see that like educating for living faith.
Beautiful. And I think I want to push a little bit more in terms of kind of thinking a little bit about how we create culturally sustaining practices. So you share kind of with your perspective for the Native American Catholic schools that you've been working with. We know across our country, demographic shifts, the Hispanic community that has often a vibrant Catholic faith, we're seeing an increase in the numbers of those students in our schools. So in what ways are you seeing Catholic schools embrace these culturally sustaining practices? So any thoughts there in terms of the research and what you're seeing nationally?
Yeah, I think one central way is through language, centering students' home languages and integrating diverse languages through the curriculum. And you can see this through what I would say are kind of more formalized or major ways, such as in dual language Catholic schools. You see that especially growing across the country, but also for schools that aren't able to implement dual language models, but just having that openness to inviting students to share in their languages, inviting parents who may have different linguistic traditions to like be part of, especially kind of in religious instances, you'll see like bilingual masses, and inviting that language both in the classroom as well as in liturgy and in other spaces in the classroom. And I think also just in the way that Catholic faith is lived out, we know we have this global church, right? That is kind of small c Catholic universal that invites various religious traditions. And I think you'll see this through like depictions of the saints at schools, making sure that the saints that you're emphasizing throughout the year are reflective of students' identities. And we see this in kind of children's literature. We talk about books as like, we see like mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Like I think we see saints playing a similar role in our Catholic school communities by allowing students to see themselves reflected, allowing them to view the lives of others, and then a way to step into the experiences of others. And so I think the diversity of saints, as well as the diversity of feasts and other manifestations of our faith, such as I've seen schools celebrating different devotions to Mary. So coming together and celebrating all the different ways that we celebrate Mary, whether that's Guadalupe, La Señora de la Nube, whether that's Our Lady of Czestochowa, bringing those traditions together to see how our Catholic faith really stretches across, while also is very unique to each context. So it's kind of this very Catholic both and of inviting this universality of the faith while also recognizing that the ways that each community does this are distinct and very rich in what it can reveal about who God is. And then finally, I think Jim mentioned a bit about, Catholic social teaching, inviting students into opportunities to reflect on the signs of the times. Culturally sustaining pedagogy really draws on kind of justice orientations and working towards better worlds. And I think that Catholic social teaching is such a rich resource from a young age to draw from for our students in seeing how, kind of Jess's point about service, faith, justice, these things all come together, and then actually having them act for justice as part of their education, not just kind of talking about it, but the doing of it. We talked about, you're not just teaching, but they're doing. And I think from young ages, we can be doing that. And that's something I see a big opportunity for, especially in kind of K-8 Catholic schools. I think our high schools are really pushing forward on integrating Catholic social teaching, and so are our K-8 schools, but sometimes we grapple with how to do this. And I think just integrating those ideas of like human dignity and resources and how we care for creation and all of these elements can be part of it K-12. So I think those are just a few ways that I'm seeing schools doing this in really powerful ways.
Awesome. These are great examples, and thank you for sharing. And I, again, encourage all to, purchase the book, but also to then take a look at this chapter as Katie gets a bit more in depth on some of these examples. And we also highlight, places where it's happening. We kind of various proof points and across our country of schools that are really living out their spiritual domain well. I'm going to actually share my screen again because we're going to kind of dive into a little bit and examine the essential elements. So part of our, make sure I can see all of you while I share my screen. Part of our playbook, we really want to make it accessible for educators to utilize and to think, how do I see the spiritual domain in my classroom? How do I see this manifesting across the school community? And so we articulated essential elements in each domain. So within the spiritual domain, these are some things that we're hearing Jess and Jim comment on, right? We have reflection and prayer on a regular basis. We celebrate communion, right? We celebrate the Eucharist together as a community. We integrate our faith, nourish our faith as a community. We create safe and caring areas, right? The communities, right? So like Jess was talking a little bit about that idea of hospitality and belonging. We make sure that sacraments are central to our work. We, to Katie's point around care for the creation at the end there, right? So these are all kind of essential elements that we want to be looking at, because when we kind of unpack a spirituality, it's so large and complex. So what are some just key focus areas for us? We take those essential elements and unpack it with a domain checklist. So this is, again, a wonderful resource for teachers to kind of be able to say, am I living this out in my classroom? Or for school leaders to say, as a school community, are we reflecting, as this first example, a deep care for all students, faculty, and staff? Does that exist? Should we kind of, and in what ways does this exist? Or is this an area stretch goal for us? In an example, the second one, staff can articulate the meaning of their core values, right? And how they inspire their community. So hopefully with Jess and her leadership now at Cathedral, we would be able to say, yes, we see this happening, and it's not only beginning, it's more of an advance, and maybe in 2 years it's developed. And what does that look like across our community? So these checklists are really intended to be very user-friendly and something that hopefully educators can take and apply in their school setting, right? If it's across a system or in a school community, or even in one's research. So I'd love to hear from our panelists because they've had a preview of the spiritual chapter and the essential elements and the domain checklist. I'd love to hear from you as to how you would use or may use a checklist like this across your school community. So let's start with Jim. We'll go to Jess, and then we'll finish with Katie. So Jim, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So I have two, and one is extremely practical, right? Accreditation. We have 7 schools going through it right now. This would be a really great quick temperature check of how am I going to do in domain A for my accreditation on mission and identity. So this is a quick tool to utilize if you want to do a walk through your school, interview some of your constituents, your teachers, your students, your family members, and it'll give you a really quick snapshot of how vibrant is my faith life, right? How excited is the school for our mission and identity? How on fire are we? And if there's gaps, then you know where those gaps are going to lie, and you can isolate and work on a plan to address those gaps. That's very pragmatic and not particularly inviting, right? I think the second part would be, who do you want your students and your faculty to be? You have these students from kindergarten through 8th grade if you're at elementary school. And the question that we don't ask a lot of our 8th graders is, how has being here changed you? How has being a member of this Catholic community made you a better person in the way that you treat people, in the way that you think about your own spirituality, in the things that you want to do to make the world a different place? Same with your faculty. How has being a faculty member here for the past 28 years changed you, or the past 2 years? We know that retention, both in students and faculty, is at a high need. We want to keep our students and our teachers at our schools. And how are these things on the checklist, the spiritual domain, allowing and inviting our students and faculty members to stay part of a community? And how has it changed them over time? And so hopefully at the end of 8 years, they can articulate an 8th grader saying, yeah, all of these things, the Catholic rituals, the prayer, have invited me to have a relationship with God, and this is what I want to do now as I move into high school. Or as a faculty member, I used to see religious instruction as just one of my academic subjects, and now I see this as character formation. So I think the first part is very practical in the accreditation world, but I think the second aspect of it is very qualitative in what kind of people do we want to be.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I think that kind of always thinking about who we're called to be, right? During this time of Lent, always trying to think about that moment of who God is calling us. And so having that end in mind is really important. So thanks, Jim. Jess, how about for you?
Yeah. I mean, my initial reaction, one of my good friends, would say that great leaders give themselves feedback, right? And I think that this is like the tool that you need to kind of give yourself that moment of self-reflection. I think that, speaking from a school leader perspective, it's really, really important to take the time, to look at the big picture. As school leaders, we're constantly pivoting from big picture to details, and it's challenging sometimes. And I think that a tool like this is really, really helpful in order to take a big step back and look at the big picture of the spiritual domain of your school. And personally, I struggle with things that are binary in terms of yes or no. So I appreciate a nice little range of approaching, emerging. I really do think that most of our schools, right, we fall somewhere in those lines. And so I think having the ability to not just think, do we do this yes or no, but how well do we do this? Can we do this better? Can we serve our students better by really taking an honest look? So for me, I think it's a great tool.
Yeah, good. It's always helpful to have that kind of reflection to go back and say, okay. And I'm sure thinking about it, even like when the first time you became a principal to now your new school, even how much we kind of continue to grow and understand our faith and how we help to kind of embrace that and have it come alive in our school communities. Like what a great kind of measure of growth, I'm sure, for you when you think about that. Katie, how about for you in terms of like with either the American Indian Network of Catholic Schools or even the research that you do? How would these resources be credible and you could utilize them across the domains that
Yeah, I mean, I think to Jess's point, I see this tool as reflective rather than prescriptive. Like it's not meant to be this kind of like assessment that maybe is done externally, such as you would in an accreditation process, but rather a process of reflection. So I think for researchers, it can be a really good tool through which to engage schools in conversations about their current practices and next steps for growth. Because spirituality and the development of your spiritual domain is so complex and multifaceted and also very personal, it can be one of the more challenging things to measure or like examine when looking at Catholic schools. And I think this is why sometimes we see a gap in some of the literature about like the enactment of like the spiritual domain, because how do you measure a student's faith, right? And I think we're not saying that we're here to measure a student's faith, but we're here to say that there's ways we can foster this as Catholic schools. And this checklist kind of helps lay down some of those things of what that might look, sound, and feel like in a school. And I think that's what's really helpful about this is it breaks it down into concrete and observable practices, both by those collaborating with schools, whether that's researchers, coaches, external partners, as well as those inside of schools. And I think there's really fruitful conversations to be had about those concrete and observable practices between like entities in and out of schools, and how those are lived out and habitual within a school community, and ways that that can then help inform practice for how schools can continue growing on that spectrum. And I think also just like reflection on this, even in this conversation, the ability to talk about these types of practices across schools is what also really benefits, as schools can learn from each other if there's particular strengths or particular areas of growth. And that's why I really appreciate this like book as a resource, because we do bring together these examples of like ways that particular schools in each of those domains are doing things exceptionally well, and lifting that out of each other to then change our own practice.
Yeah, we're one vibrant Catholic school community. So being able to share and exchange through this dialogue, or even, making a trip to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or New York City, right, to visit and see these practices in action is really some way that we can continue to strengthen our Catholic school system. So while our participants, please be welcome to put a question that you may have in the chat. I'm actually going to pull up a quick quote here that I think also is something that we think a little bit about kind of what we're called to do here in our Catholic school communities, right? We want our students to set foot in Catholic school communities and enter into a place where they feel like they're in a new environment, right? One that's illuminated by the light of faith. And we talk a little about here in this quote, right? School climate, right? It's expressed through the celebration of Christian values and word and sacrament and individual behavior, and those relationships that we're talking about between students, between teachers, between the families, and it's readily available. And so through the daily witness, the students come to appreciate the uniqueness of the environment to which their youth has been entrusted. So this is really important. If it is not present, then there is little left which can make the school Catholic. So all of these different elements that you're talking a little bit about and that you're sharing about, really important for us to consider how we animate our faith and have that be known that our students feel like they're in that new environment. So I do have a question here from one of our participants around kind of challenges. Jim, when you think about the biggest challenges that you face when in cultivating a vibrant spiritual life across the school community, what are you finding? What are those, and how do you address them? And the same question to Jess and Katie then.
Sure. I think the challenge is sometimes meeting students where they're at. We want to meet them where we're at, and that doesn't always foster a great relationship with trying to grow spirituality. And so it's finding where the students are at and immersing ourselves in their world, be it technological, really, is part of the challenge. And so we know that our students are bombarded with social media, with phones, with gadgets, which don't usually have a high level of spirituality associated with it. So it's finding a creative way of blending those worlds and meeting our students where they're at, who we know have a hunger for the spiritual domain. And it's just finding a way to access that in a vibrant way, and a way that meets them with an encounter rather than simply information. So it's inviting them into that encounter within their world, and then bringing them further into that encounter with fostering a spiritual atmosphere and a spiritual growth plan for them, really.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. And you're right. The world is complex and changing dynamic, right? So I think kind of that media area is really one for us to continue to really think and explore about how can we integrate spirituality into these venues that students are accessing quite regularly. Jess, how about for you? Challenges when you think a little bit about that vibrant spiritual life in your school community?
Yeah, sure. I think the challenge of so many schools is always time, right? Is something to always talk about. We talked about earlier the staff formation, and that's one area that I think that time is particularly a challenge, right? There's never enough time to talk about all of the things that we need to talk about, to do all the things that we need to do. And so I think all school leaders know that experience. So personally, I think it's about really looking at the calendar and making priorities and kind of sketching out your year as best you can to make sure that you are making time for that. That when you are planning your PD, that you only have 3 very sacred hours for, that you are making sure that you're taking at least, 20 minutes of that and making sure that there's a meaningful prayer and reflection for the faculty. And so it's really about what do they say? Like, if you don't have the time, you have to make the time, right? It is really what it is. The time is there, but you have to sometimes be creative with it. But I think that as leaders, we have to remember that that time is really sacred. And so to plan ahead for that, I think is wise.
Make every minute matter. Yeah, awesome. Katie, how about for you? Any thoughts on that? Challenges?
Yeah, I think one thing is just the comfort of teachers engaging in conversations and witness of faith and spiritualities, like working with pre-service and in-service teachers in Catholic schools. I think there's sometimes hesitation for teachers and faculty members about leading these types of conversations about spirituality and being that kind of witness to fostering living faith in their students. And I think we've seen a lot of ways from Jim and Jess's examples of how we can help approach this, right? As Catholic school educators, of offering formation for teachers, offering opportunities for their ongoing formation. Because we see in Catholic life often that faith formation often ends when students leave our Catholic schools, leave religious education programs, sometimes when they hit confirmation. So I think one thing is just the ongoing formation for teachers, but another aspect is recognizing the spirit and gifts within them and helping uplift that in teachers and call them out to see the gifts that they already are bringing that go beyond a level of theological education or some idea that, if I had XYZ, I'd be able to be a better, kind of bearer of the faith or witness, but to show that like God is working through each of our educators, regardless of their faith background, regardless of their level of comfort with talking about these issues of faith, that the Spirit is at work and that we're encouraging our teachers and building communities where they can be supported with peers as well in being those witnesses to faith for students.
Awesome. So many things to tend to. And while we would love to spend another hour with our friends, unfortunately, our time is coming to a close here. But please be welcome to reach out to Jim, to Jess, to Katie, myself, should you have additional questions. And we do hope that you will pick up a copy of the playbook directly from the NCEA store that you can find online. And additionally, we want to invite you to 2 additional webinars on the playbook. So on March 25th, next Tuesday, Enhancing Student Flourishing, Integrating Cognitive, Social, and Emotional Well-Being in Catholic Education. That will be led by my colleague, Dr. Molly McMahon, and she'll also have a host of amazing panelists with her. And then lastly, we'll do another one the following week on Tuesday, April 8th, Supporting the Whole Child, Understanding the Impact of Ecosystems and Physical Well-Being on Student Development with our colleague, Dr. John Reyes. So again, Jim, Jess, Katie, thank you so very much for joining us and sharing the much wisdom that you have and the many experiences that you are really doing to really enliven spirituality in your school communities. We're so grateful. And Katie, to continue to do this important research in our Catholic schools, it's really essential. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our host, Miss Christy. We'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wittenbach, for hosting this fabulous panel, and to all of our participants, Jim, Jess, and Katie. Thank you for being here and for the work that you do and the invaluable insights you've shared here on all child education, meeting the needs of our time by fostering holistic growth in our schools and communities, to live in our live in our faith and deepen our relationship with God. And today was just the beginning. Thank you very much. And to our online attendees, thank you for being here and for your thoughtful engagement. And CEA values your input as we work to continuously improve our content and services for our members. Please take a moment to complete our short survey using the link that is being shared in the chat. If you'd like a certificate of attendance, please include your name and email at the end of the survey. Certificates are sent automatically, so be sure to check your spam folder if you don't receive it within a few minutes. And one more final thank you to our panelists today. May we all continue to build up the kingdom of God through nurturing the souls in our Catholic schools. God bless you, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week for part 2. Take good care.